Will, thanks for joining early as well. You've heard all the housekeeping stuff, so really appreciate that as well.
Yeah, cheers. I'll turn my mic off now. I guess we need to go on mute. Yeah.
Just to cut out any background noise, that'd be good.
Yeah, transcription rather than.
Yeah, I'm hoping for somewhere between 25 and 35 today. I haven't seen the up-to-date numbers. Obviously, it's straight after the coronation weekend, so there might be a few sort of bleary-eyed people, but we'll have to see. But Chris, if you just admit all and then ask them to mute, that'd be good. So, and then the numbers will probably dribble in until about 10:22, 10:32, 10:33.
Susanna Moran is my scheme actually. You know Susanna?
Yeah.
So, good morning, Alan. So let's just go to people. Good morning, Ian. Good morning, Jim. Good morning, Jane. Good morning, Phil. Good morning, Scott. If you've just joined, if you could go on mute in the usual fashion, that would be good. Just to allow Will and John to start their presentation. Stuart, if you could go on mute, that would be good. Phil, yeah, that'd be good. We'll wait another minute or two for late joiners and go from there. I hope everybody's recovered from the coronation weekend, on all the pomp and circumstance. And I wonder if there was a King Charles cocktail, maybe. Did anybody invent a King Charles cocktail? I mean, maybe.
Plenty floating around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we should. If you've just joined, well, indeed, yeah. If you've just joined, if you could go on mute, that'd be brilliant. Thank you very much. And then we can get cracking. But no, we hope everybody's had a great weekend. And somebody this morning said, "Can't believe there's not a bank holiday next Monday." So we're getting used to these bank holidays, which is nice. Okay. So Chris, you'll monitor the lobby. People have been muted. It's now 10:32. We are recording. So thumbs up from everybody that everybody's happy to be recorded. Matthew, Amanda, everybody's happy. Thumbs up recording. In our usual fashion, Henry and I like to encourage people to interact. So if you want to ask a question of Will or John, then please raise a hand. We'll also open up the chat room. So if you want to put any comments in the chat, great. But I'm sure Henry or I will drag you in to say your piece. As usual, we're delighted to have with us Will Rice and Jon Palin from Barnett Waddingham on a very, very interesting subject, especially involved with, obviously, if you're a DB sponsor, a DB trustee, an advisor to a DB scheme. This is serious stuff, as they say. So without further ado, I think we'll pass over to you, Will, and you can introduce yourself and John for everybody's benefit. And we are now recording. So thanks everybody for joining, and welcome.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks very much. It's disappointing to have your confirmation there's no bank holiday next Monday. I was sort of getting used to them, but never mind. We've got an interesting talk today. So I'm Will Rice. I'm a partner and scheme actuary at Barnett Waddingham, and Jon Palin, who's with me. John's also a partner at Barnett Waddingham, and John's one of our in-house longevity experts. So we're going to be talking about longevity assumptions, particularly thinking about what's happened since 2020 and the pandemic, and how that's sort of feeding into assumptions used by DB schemes for longevity. So my perspective on this is thinking about, what does it all mean for trustees when we come to set assumptions? And John's going to be talking to us about the data and the trends and what we're seeing in that analysis and what that all means. Please do sort of ask questions as we go through. Hope you have a good discussion. And I think that's enough of an intro, so we'll move into the slides. So what I'm hoping to convince you of today is that setting mortality assumptions is a bit like steering a ship down a river. So we've got our pension scheme. We know we're trying to get to at the end of the river, whether that's a buyout or some other objective. We set our course and we set our assumptions based on what we think is going to happen when it comes to longevity. But as we sort of move down the river over time, more information emerges, new evidence comes out, and we need to adjust our course and change the assumption. And to the extent that we don't do that, we sort of drift off course, and we might find ourselves in a different position with more or less assets than we need for what we're trying to do. So we're going to talk about mortality today, or longevity, in 3 areas. So first of all, looking at the past, so the last few years, mainly sort of running up to the pandemic, and then what's happened over that pandemic period, which I'm referring to here as the experience on the river, looking back down the river. And then we're going to look at the more sort of recent experience, what's going on at the moment, so the present, which in my river analogy is looking around, what's the information we're getting through on the weather, the reports on the conditions on the river, I suppose. And then finally, we're then thinking about the future trends, which is the most difficult bit to sort of predict, and no one really knows what's going to happen, but that's a big part of our assumption, and that really influences how we set liabilities. So we need to have a view on how we think these trends are going to play out in future. So that's the sort of future bit, looking ahead down the river, what can we anticipate in future. And then towards the end, I'll give some comments on what I think this means in terms of typically how schemes are setting assumptions, and then what that typically does to liabilities, particularly compared to where we were before the pandemic came along. So I think that then leads us into the first section. I'm just going to hand over to John to talk about the past.
Thank you, Will, and good morning, everyone. Apologies in advance. My dedication to this topic means that I've picked up a cough and a cold and some COVID symptoms currently. So sorry if I'm sort of coughing a lot during this. So we sort of start looking to give some context, looking at some past data, and also think around how a scheme actuary, a longevity actuary, has tended to sort of conceptualize the components of mortality. So we know that mortality varies by lots of factors. It varies by age and gender, for example. To try and keep things relatively simple for now, we're just going to look at pensioner mortality and a single measure. So ages 65 to 95 combined, and males and females combined. And here we're showing mortality over time, and we're expressing it relative to mortality in 2019. So if we go back to the start of the century, going back to 2000 or so, mortality was round about 40% higher than in 2019. And during the first decade or so, it fell really very quickly. Sort of the percentage reduction in mortality, the mortality improvement year on year, was running at around 2.5% or so, which was historically very high. We have never seen a reduction in pension mortality as fast as we saw through this period here. And as well as being a really dramatic, rapid fall, it was also a pretty steady fall. If I draw a trend line through those dots, the dots are pretty close to that line. Some years it was a bit higher, some years it was a bit lower. There's volatility from year to year. Perhaps there's a particularly cold or mild winter, or flu season was particularly bad or not. But broadly, we saw a pretty strong, steady fall. That changed round about 2011 or so. Since then, mortality has continued to fall, but at a much more slow rate. So whereas the percentage reduction year on year up to 2011 was around about 2.5%, it's been more like 0.5% since. So by the time we got to 2019, the last year before the pandemic, there was good news in a sense. 2019 had lower mortality for pensioners than at any time ever, but there was quite a gap that compared to what we might have expected. So that dot for 2019 is 10-12% or so above what we might have expected. Despite the fact that we saw that sort of quite strong change in the rate of mortality improvements, we can still sort of just about draw a smooth curve through those points. So this grey line here is taken from CMI 2019. So the version of the widely used CMI mortality projections model that was published in early 2020 based on data up to 2019. And this is really how we've how we were tending to think about mortality. There were sort of relatively slowly varying long-term trends, things like people's behavior, smoking, diet, developments in medicine, those sorts of factors which led to fairly sort of steady, slow changes in mortality, and then individual years may have been a bit higher or lower. If I throw in some more lines here, so here I've put some dashed lines which are 3% above and below that seen in my 2019 trend. And through the whole of this period, although there is volatility from year to year, the cold winters, the flu and so on, it's pretty steady. We aren't seeing any year having mortality that's more than 3% away from this trend. But as we all know, things changed rather dramatically in 2020. Excuse me. If we look at 2020 as a whole, mortality wasn't on trend. It wasn't 3% higher. It was around 14% higher. A really big change. 2021 wasn't quite so bad, but still well outside that plus or minus 3% range. Mortality in 2021 around 8% higher than in 2019. Things continue to improve a bit in 2022, but still plus 5% compared to 2019. So this has been a really strange period. In terms of how much mortality jumped in 2020 compared to the previous trend, you'd have to go back to the flu pandemic of 1918. This has been a really strange period. And so this really poses a challenge to us in terms of how we think about mortality and how we think about projecting it forwards. Our sort of previous methods have tended to be quite strongly based on past data, look for trends in past data, the idea that the recent past should be a guide to the near-term future. And that really worked pretty well up until 2019 when changes were fairly smooth. But these really big dramatic changes that we saw in 2020, 21 and 2022 mean that those sort of methods don't really work so well. Back to you, Will.
Thanks, John. So so this was a real sort of obviously a significant change, and in terms of setting longevity assumption, it kind of just throws everything out in terms of the models and how they work and what assumptions we're trying to make. So I think in terms of what schemes need to do and schemes need to think about when setting assumptions, I think in terms of this sort of starting point, I think the important thing is to understand where you're starting from, where your baseline is for a particular scheme. So what a lot of schemes did at this point in time is there was a lot of uncertainty, and it was difficult to know exactly how everything was going to pan out in terms of COVID and the knock-on implications. And a lot of schemes made no adjustment to their mortality assumptions, whereas actually at the time it felt like probably, if anything, this change is going to lead to heavier mortality, either through COVID or the knock-on impacts, which we're going to talk more about shortly. So because it feels like the risks are to the sort of the downside in terms of mortality, it was prudent to make no adjustment. So a lot of schemes made no adjustment to their assumption. So I think the important thing now is to just look back and remember what you did for a particular scheme around this time, and sort of remind yourself of, did we sort of deliberately take a cautious view and not make any change in light of the pandemic? And the other important question to remind yourself of is, did we do that because that was what we thought was the right answer, or did we do it because we were being more prudent in light of the uncertainty? And so I think for a lot of schemes it was that prudent reason. And so I think if that's the case, then as time goes on and things become a bit clearer, some of that uncertainty goes away, then maybe it starts to be time to consider unwinding some of that extra prudence. Although obviously it depends on circumstances, and some schemes might say actually we need some extra prudence for some other reasons. But yeah, it was a real turning point, I think, for longevity assumptions. So it's good to look back and remember how you reacted for a particular scheme. So we're going to come on now to that was the build up to the pandemic. I'm going to come on to some more recent information, so the present.
Thanks, Will. So yes, we've looked at data for calendar years previously, but it's quite informative to look at more detailed data through the pandemic. So This chart here is looking at how mortality has varied sort of since the start of 2020. The way we're showing mortality here is relative to the corresponding part of 2019. So in a sort of normal non-pandemic year, we generally find that mortality is relatively high in January and February, maybe that's sort of 10-15% above average. By the time we get to August, it's maybe about 10% below. So to try and sort of strip out that normal seasonal variation, what we've done here is to say, how did mortality at a particular point in time compare to the same point in 2019? So the point for January 2020 is saying that mortality here was about 10% higher than in January 2019. The point for July 2020, for example, is saying that mortality there was about 5% lower than in July 2019. So we've stripped out the normal seasonal patterns here. So we're again looking at pensioner mortality. I think there are a few sort of things to pick out here. The first is the big peak we saw in 2020. So in April 2020, we saw some weeks where mortality was double what we saw 12 months previously. A really strange period. A second fairly big peak towards the start of 2021, not quite as high as the first. Mortality maybe around 50% higher than in the same part of 2019. And then following both of those peaks, we saw mortality being comparatively low for the time of year. Likely explanation for that is that while COVID had impact broadly across society, in terms of mortality, it affected disproportionately people who were comparatively old and frail. So we think those dips that we're seeing around about July 2020 and in the second quarter of 2021, those are really deaths which weren't happening then because some of those deaths had been brought forwards by the pandemic. So that's really the pattern of the first half of this chart, two really strong peaks and then low periods following those. By the time we get to sort of mid-2021, things had definitely calmed down a bit. We didn't see such big peaks. We saw vaccines. We saw that people had typically had COVID themselves once, twice more maybe. So deaths from COVID were continuing, but at a relatively low level. But mortality didn't get back down to 2019 levels. Sort of through the second half of this chart, we've seen some smaller peaks, smaller troughs, but mortality's tended to be maybe sort of 5, 6, 7% higher than we would have expected before the pandemic. Some big peaks, particularly at the start of 2023, but yes, round about sort of 5, 6, 7% higher, through the right-hand side of this chart. This next chart is something produced by the CMI, so it's looking at deaths in each quarter, comparing those to in the corresponding quarter of 2019, and saying, for example, for the first wave, there were around 63,000 more deaths in the UK in the second quarter of 2020 than we would have expected if mortality had been the same as in the second quarter of 2019. And again, I think when we come to look at what might happen next, the first half of the chart is perhaps sort of less relevant. Those were very strange, exceptional times, but perhaps sort of the second half is most relevant. And that's really showing that, with the exception of the first quarter of 2022, when flu was fairly low for the time of year, we've seen sort of fairly steadily mortality being higher than we saw before the pandemic, sort of running at around 10,000 deaths per quarter or so. And perhaps sort of somewhat worryingly, 3 years after the start of the pandemic, looking at the last 4 quarters, it's perhaps not such a flat trend, but excuse me, that trend is going up. If we look at those figures in a slightly different way, throughout the whole of 2022, we saw around 31,000 more deaths than we would have expected based on pre-pandemic mortality. But in the first quarter of 2023, we've seen more than 20,000 just in that quarter. So it's obviously quite uncertain what will happen through the remaining 8 or so months of 2023. But it seems reasonably likely that while we saw that excess mortality was high in 2020, came down a bit in 2021, came down further in 2022, it seems unlikely that it's going to go down further. You know, it wouldn't be surprising if we see mortality in 2023 being worse than in 2022. What's been driving that? So there definitely have been deaths from COVID. You know, we're seeing COVID deaths running at maybe sort of 500-600 per week, being 5 or 6% of all-cause mortality. But that's that's accounting for only a part of the difference we're seeing compared to 2019. We are seeing higher mortality from non-COVID causes. There was some sort of speculation during the pandemic that sort of while treatment for cancer was largely continuing, if people were showing symptoms, they may be reluctant to go and see a doctor. If cancers were being screened later, if they were being caught later, then cancer mortality may have got worse. We're not really seeing much evidence of that yet. That's not to say it won't emerge in future, but we're not seeing much of that yet. Where the excess mortality, the non-COVID excess mortality tends to be things that need rapid care. So if you need to go to hospital and be seen quickly, heart and circulatory diseases, those seem to be where most of the excess is coming. Let me pass back to Will for a bit more.
Great, thanks, John. So the point I wanted to sort of draw out here, really, in terms of my analogy of sailing down the river, is that this evidence to do with longevity emerges quite slowly over time, and I think that can that's important in the context of this assumption and this longevity risk, because it can be different to some other assumptions, and so the way that we manage that risk needs to sort of align with that. So if we think back to 2020, we thought, okay, well, we don't know how the pandemic is going to affect our assumptions. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know yet the impact of the pandemic. So one response to that could be, well, let's wait a little bit until we've got that information, we've got more evidence on what we think the pandemic's doing to longevity, how long people are living, and then change our assumption. But I think the problem with that mindset is that it takes years and years for this information to emerge, and you can see now we're sort of 3 years on, and we're still getting information coming through, but we don't know for sure what all of this means. So actually, the way that this information comes out is that we need to sort of gradually adjust our view, reflecting the data as it emerges, but we're not going to know for sure what the impact is of these sort of longer term trends until they emerge gradually over the long term. So for schemes dealing with this type of risk, I think you can either keep a close eye on what's happening and make these sort of small adjustments, sort of keep steering the ship as we go down the river, or you can only look at it more occasionally, but then you need to accept that there might be this drift, and then you make this sort of bigger adjustment from time to time. There's a question in the chat about prudence, so maybe I'll sort of pick that up now. So my comments before about prudence, I think it is important to make sure we know where we're making prudent assumptions and where we're making assumptions because we think it's our best view of the future, and we need to sort of have those two views of the world. So when we make a plan for when a scheme's going to get to buyout, or when a scheme's going to reach a certain funding level, how much contributions are needed, what investment strategy is needed to get there, it's helpful to have an understanding of what our best guess is of the future without prudence built in. Otherwise we might make a decision based on the wrong data. But then when we come to adding prudence in because we want a buffer against future experience, it's then helpful to have that prudence in there. So I think for me, I think that the potential problems arise if we have unintended prudence, or we don't realize we've got prudence in our assumptions, and then we might be sort of planning based on the wrong information. Have a quick look at the
Well, we've got a few
through.
questions coming through. Maybe start with Henry, then Andy, then Bob, I guess.
Oh, I think my question has just been addressed by Will. But I mean, it does seem to me that when we first sort of got the shock horror of 2020, a lot of actuaries were saying it's too early to tell, it's too early to tell, and nothing really happened. And I thought at the time, oh goodness, you're being a bit over prudent, if you like. Don't you think you ought to start building in some of this into your thing? And they were said, no, give it time, give it time. So I really just sort of like wanted to understand what the actuarial mindset was there, why it was that people were very, very cautious about adjusting mortality in 2020-21, and why it's taken until now to really accept that something has changed. And that wasn't a criticism, it's just clarification of how the actuarial mindset works.
Yeah, so it's good point, good question. I guess I kind of look at it as there's a balance between being cautious and sort of looking at the certainty in the data, and with mortality it's always tricky because, like I say, we never quite have that certainty, but at some point we need to think, have we got enough evidence to adjust the assumption? And as we're going to come on to talk about a bit later, I think now, and I think over the last few months, I think it has felt like, to me, we've got enough evidence to be shifting assumptions from where we were before the pandemic. So I think, disregarding being prudent just for the sake of being cautious, I think there is enough evidence to adjust assumptions now. But I guess right in the heat of the pandemic, the difficulty was then it was just the uncertainty was much bigger and the evidence wasn't there, so it was more difficult to make a call at that point.
Thank you.
Okay, Andy, you got a question? Andy, why?
Hi, thanks very much for this, guys. My two questions were very factual, if I can remember them now, because they've disappeared from my view. But the first one was just whether the comparison with 2019 allowed for the aging of the population since then. Other things being equal, we would have expected, I think, more deaths over time. And that seems to be what we have. So I wasn't sure if you'd already allowed for that in coming to the comparison. And the second one was the answer yes? Sorry.
Yes, we did. Yes. So the calculations use what we call an age standardized mortality rate. So we basically say if you had a certain age and gender structure of the population which didn't change over time, what would have happened to deaths? So yes, we do. Yeah.
Excellent.
We do make allowance. Yeah.
Very good. Excellent. And the other one was whether you have any up-to-date experience on pension scheme mortality. All this analysis, I think, is from population mortality, and it would be interesting to know if DB schemes have had similar experience, or whether it's select in some ways it needs to be taken account of in thinking of DB assumptions. We
do have some data on that. Yes, we will touch on that in the third part of the presentation.
Excellent.
Yeah, if that's right. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Bob, do you want to mention your question, or?
Yeah, please do. I'd asked Kevin McDonald in the previous session on mortality, the CMI results. There was a bit of a blip with younger people dying of heart and circulatory type conditions, and I'm just wondering, with your updated numbers, it's showing a rising number of excess mortality, and that for the first quarter of 2023 it's higher than it probably was expected. Has any analysis been done of the excess mortality for age? What age is this coming? Is it retired pensioners, or is it across the population, or is it a particular group? Like quite a number of younger sportsmen seem to be dying of heart problems on the pitch, and there's a worry that it may be something to do with the vaccines that have been given to people.
Okay, yeah. So I think it's probably a bit of a sort of distinction to be made there. So when we look at sort of the total number of excess deaths in population, the vast majority of those are at relatively high ages, just because the vast majority of deaths happen at high ages. If we're looking at sort of how recent mortality compares to pre-pandemic mortality for different age groups, there we are seeing something of a pattern by age. And yes, sort of working age people, the percentage increase recently compared to 2019 is a bit higher than for high ages. I mean, sort of the sort of comment on sort of sports people in particular, I think that there's perhaps sort of been a tendency to pick on a few high-profile cases. I think sort of looking at data on causes of death and vaccine causes, I'm not seeing that as a driver of mortality myself. I mean, I think it can be sort of picked on when sort of a famous high-profile person dies. It sort of makes the news, but I don't think that's a big driver.
Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for your questions there, Bob. Will, back to you. Sorry. Yeah.
Great. No, thank you. Yeah. Thanks for the questions. So I think I'm now handing back to John. So we talked about the present. Now we're looking into the future trends.
Okay. Thanks. So I think, but perhaps these next couple of slides perhaps sort of pick up a bit on the question of sort of what the view was in 2020. I mean, I think there genuinely was a view then that the pandemic would affect mortality in a wide range of ways, some of which would be positive, some would be negative. And I think things back then felt perhaps more balanced than they do now. So in terms of how the pandemic might lead to mortality rates being higher, sort of the drive for developments of a COVID vaccine, the sort of technological advancements there could be good for other diseases. There was perhaps a thought sort of back in 2020, people were being sort of informed about hygiene, mask wearing was very common. There was a thought, will it become normal to wear a mask during the winter flu season, for example? Might the pandemic act as a bit of a catalyst for a change in behaviour so that flu deaths are lower in future? I think also at a time when the pandemic had affected a relatively small proportion of the population, the thought was if perhaps, the pandemic was sort of disproportionately affecting people who were relatively old, relatively weak, would the average health of the remaining population be better than it was before? So those were sort of seen as possible positives. I think as time's gone on, a sort of current view, we don't really see people wearing masks on trains, in shops. I think sort of the potential benefits in terms of flu don't really seem to be there. I think the thought about would the surviving population be stronger, that's definitely got weaker as the vast majority of the population has now had COVID once or more, and so I think the balance has shifted somewhat since 2020, not just in terms of being prudent, but actually sort of a best estimate view has also sort of shifted. So there's perhaps not too much on the positive side now. On the negative side, we are still continuing 3 or so years on, to see deaths from COVID. We're seeing long COVID, the sheer volume of people needing medical care, the fact that COVID is affecting people who work in the NHS, that is causing pressures as well. So yeah, I think there has been a genuine shift in best estimate view from being perhaps slightly negative to more negative, and also the weight of evidence has grown as well over time. Of course, there are other influences apart from COVID on mortality. I'm not going to go through these in any great detail given time, but I think in particular, the change in the economy compared to 2019 is something big. That has various impacts. So the fact that the cost of gas, for example, has gone up greatly for individuals trying to heat their homes through the winter, that becomes tougher. The impact on the economy as a whole, the fact that GDP growth is now lower, that sort of constrains what the government is able to do in terms of spending on health and social care. And the fact that inflation is high, that increased the government costs in those areas. We've seen pay disputes, strikes, and so on. So the nature of the economy is, I think, bad for the prospects for mortality compared to where we were before the pandemic. There's a question about how pension schemes, how pension scheme members have been affected by the pandemic. What I've got here is some data from some recent analysis by the CMI on what they call their SAPS investigation. So that's self-administered pension schemes. So essentially, the bold rows are showing how mortality has been affected in pension schemes, and the non-bold rows are for the general population. So if we compare 2020 to 2019, we talked before about mortality being about 14% higher in 2020 than in 2019. There's a bit of a difference by age. So men were hit a bit more, so 15% for men, 12% for women. Mortality in pension schemes did definitely increase quite substantially between 2019 and by 2020, but not by the same extent as in the general population. Similarly, excuse me, comparing 2021 to 2019, in the general population, mortality went up by around 8%, but in the SAPS data set, in the pension scheme data set, it went up by around 3 or 4%. So in terms of what's happened historically during those 2 years of the pandemic, pension scheme members haven't been hit as badly. I think that there's perhaps a distinction to be made between what was the impact of the pandemic sort of during its peak years on the pension scheme, and how will pension scheme members be affected by other factors going forwards. So, the pressures on the economy, for example, spending on the NHS, that would probably have a fairly broad impact across society. Perhaps the very better off pensioners may have better access to private care, but there's a distinction to be made about what happened in the past and how that affected pension scheme members versus general population versus what might happen in the future. Another consideration for pension scheme members. So this is covering a pre-pandemic period. This is using a measure of deprivation, which basically says, based on where you live, based on your postcode, we can put people into 3 groups. Do you live in a more deprived area, somewhere in the middle, or a less deprived area? And over a sustained period, we've seen that sorry, I should say this is the improvement in mortality, so the percentage reduction in mortality. And when we've seen that those reductions, those improvements, have historically been higher in the less deprived areas. Pension scheme members tend to come slightly more from less deprived areas, but when you look at a liability value, a pound amount, those people with the big pensions, perhaps the 20% of members whose liability is maybe 75, 80% of the scheme, those sort of disproportionately come from less deprived areas. I think historically they've seen higher mortality improvements. They've seen mortality falling faster. And I think a challenging economy means that is probably likely to continue, and perhaps that gap between the more and less deprived areas might even get bigger. So I've thrown lots of thoughts in here. I'm not a scheme actuary, but Will is, and ultimately Will has to sort of form a view. So let me pass back to Will to share some thoughts on that.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, so it's always the case, I think, with these longevity assumptions that no one really knows the answer, and so there isn't an answer really to what we think is going to happen in future to longevity trends. But when it comes to pension scheme valuations for scheme actuaries and trustees, we have to come up with an answer because we need to set an assumption. So this is a slide from September last year, when John and I spoke at our pensions conference about these sort of trends. And so at that time, we were really sort of presenting this view, and this was my sort of take and my view on things at that time, that's in line with the the factors John was just talking about. So compared to 2020 on the left-hand side, when looking back to what schemes were doing then, there was some caution about what was going to happen. There's some uncertainty. A lot of schemes didn't adjust their liabilities at all because of the due to longevity assumptions. If they did, maybe they made a small reduction, something like a 1% decrease, to reflect the fact that these factors are more likely, perhaps, to reduce longevity than the other way around. If we contrast that with 2022, and my view at that point was actually the balance has tipped, as John was describing. So those factors on the right-hand side had come more to the fore. There was more evidence of the impact on knock-on impact of longevity of the economy, the NHS pressures, and also COVID was continuing. Whereas the left-hand side, some of those positives we thought might have come through in 2020 had sort of receded a bit. So the lessons learned from COVID and the mask wearing, that the evidence wasn't really there. So my view in September last year was actually, when we're steering the ship and making adjustments, if you want to have the same amount of prudence as you had before the pandemic, so sort of stripping out any sort of circumstances where you might deliberately put in prudence, I would say that you should be making a change to your longevity assumption, which would reduce your liabilities by something like 2% compared to 2020 if you hadn't done anything, whereas if you had made this 1% shift in 2020, made this another 1% to get to the sort of order of 2% reduction. Now, what's happened since September 2020 is, to sort of cut to the chase, I think my view would be broadly the same. So we've seen some more evidence of the higher deaths coming through over the last few months, which sort of reinforces some of these ideas and some of this evidence that there is this knock-on impact of the pandemic on some of these factors on the right-hand side. There is a bit more evidence about this widening inequality between the sort of richer and poorer areas of the country, if you like. So that's a sort of note of caution about what the impact's going to be on pension schemes. But I think because of that weight of evidence coming through on the right-hand side, I'd sort of land broadly on the same sort of position now as I did in September 2022. I'm going to comment a little bit more in a second on something else that's sort of emerged since then. So I think on the next slide, I'm just taking the opportunity to shamelessly plug an article that I wrote, which is about this story we talked about today. So what happened in 2020? How did schemes sort of think about this and adjust their views of longevity assumptions over time? So if you want to have something to read through and about what we've been talking about, then that's the link to that article there, which is sort of the story we talked about today. On the next slide, we've then got a slide to update something that has happened more recently since that September 22 slide. So the CMI has released a consultation on its plans for the next version of the CMI model. Now at Barnett Waddingham, we do a lot of work with this CMI, and John is particularly closely involved with a lot of the work in the background going into these CMI models. Although today we are sort of talking in a personal capacity rather than on behalf of the CMI. So the CMI consultation was about how the CMI was going to shift its model in light of these trends. And looking back to 2020 and 2021, until this consultation, the CMI's core model had been to not use the data from those years. So effectively to sort of not make a change to longevity assumptions in its core model for the effect of the pandemic. But due to the sort of weight of evidence and these trends that we've been talking about, the CMI is now proposing to put some weight on the data for 2022, which effectively is this shift we're talking about. So the shift in assumptions to allow for a reduction in liabilities if we use the core version of the CMI model. And consistent with what I just said, this produces life expectancy assumptions around 2% lower than they were before. So I think this doesn't really change the underlying trends, but what this does do in practice, I think, is that behaviourally, I think a lot of schemes will now start to use different assumptions and adopt this model, because when the CMI model, the core version of the model didn't allow for the pandemic, it's maybe a bit more difficult for trustees and schemes to sort of do the work and form a view and sort of make an adjustment. Whereas when the sort of core model itself is shifting based on this data, I think that'll steer a lot of schemes to start making this change now. And the consultation responses included broad agreement from the industry to what's being proposed. It's always very difficult to get a precise understanding of how insurance pricing is changing in response to mortality trends. But there's some sort of evidence in the responses. Perhaps the insurers might be a bit slower in places to sort of adjust and their assumptions. But generally, I'd expect this to sort of shift how assumptions are being set in the industry. Right, so I'm going to come on to a sort of summing up slide. I think there might be a few questions we can maybe pick up in a moment. So Taking a step back then, so perhaps I've persuaded you that mortality assumptions is a bit like sailing down the river. The information does emerge gradually, so we need to sort of keep an eye on that if we want to sort of stay on course. And taking a step back from this risk, there's these three options on the slide for how to manage longevity risk. So at the bottom, settling liabilities, we could go to an insurer, pass over the scheme to an insurer and get rid of that risk. Moving up one, there are longevity hedging solutions available. They tend to be only really for the larger schemes. For it to be worth the investment and the time to sort of set up these contracts, then you can hedge these movements in longevity over time. But for a lot of schemes, for most schemes, we're probably in the top bullet there, looking to sort of manage this risk over time. So the idea is to then keep an eye on these trends as they emerge and keep sort of adjusting the assumption and sort of steering the ship as we go down the river. So today is part of that adjustment and checking the data and steering. So yeah, hopefully these comments have been helpful for you to do that. And I think that's going to bring us to the end of our content. So yeah, probably time for some questions.
There is a question from Chris Bunford. Chris, do you want to ask your question as you got your hand up and take stuff off mute?
Oh, cheers. Thanks, Henry. Yeah, thanks, Will and John. Great presentation. I just the negative points you popped in on there for future mortality. To my mind, most of them were potentially fairly short or medium term. Hopefully, short or medium term in terms of like the economy being bad, the NHS not being funded or staffed to sort of proper levels. If we look 10, 15, 20 years in the future and come to a world where the economy is back, the NHS is well funded, are there many arguments that we wouldn't join back up with the original line that was improving from 2010 to 2019? That's all. I know it had sloped a little bit up before then, but yeah, longer term, do we expect kind of heavier mortality, do you think, or mainly over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question on the future of the economy is an interesting one. We saw that sort of looking back at GDP, there was sort of a fairly sort of strong trend up till around about sort of 2009 or so, and then it fell back down again. Perhaps sort of 2016 Brexit, there was a bit of a hit. The pandemic, there was a bit of a hit. I think it sort of feels plausible that the state of the economy will sort of get back to the growth rate it had before, but whether it can also grow that bit faster to catch up again, that feels like a much sort of tougher test. So I mean, I think sort of my perception might be that there will be a gap between what we might have expected and where we are, and that gap perhaps won't continue getting bigger, but it feels quite challenging to close that gap up. So we may see that the level of mortality improvements are getting back to what we might have expected, but perhaps on a mortality permanently being, I don't know, 5%, let's say for sake of argument, above what our sort of pre-pandemic expectations might have been.
There's a question too from Michael Bromwich. Michael, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to ask?
No, I'll do it. It's a bit of an outlier. You gave us a lot of information for the usual pension schemes we're talking about, and they're going to have quite considerable effects. I was trying to think about what amount of that information affects DC schemes, because it always seems to me that's never mentioned when we talk about DC schemes, but it must surely be relevant to them.
Yes, I think I think it's a good point. I think it is relevant to DC schemes because anyone who's a member of a DC scheme like me should be planning for how much we need to invest in the pension, how much money we need to sort of budget for that future retirement and the annuity we need to buy. So these trends are all very very relevant, and I suppose it's only because of the DB structure and the fact that trustees are sort of need to make these assumptions, that we sort of end up having more of these conversations around the DB side, and in the context of a DC scheme, that responsibility is put back onto the members to to think about these issues. But I think potentially maybe John might have some thoughts on this as well, but I think there is evidence that we all tend to underestimate our own life expectancy, and so this sort of information and education about longevity, I think, is important for everyone and for DC scheme members to avoid sort of making the wrong financial planning decisions because we're underestimating how long we're going to live.
Yes. I mean, I think potentially it does feel less material for a DC scheme, in the sense that if I'm thinking about planning my retirement, if my best estimate is, let's say that I'm going to live 20 years in retirement, if that 20 has gone down to 19 and a half because of the pandemic, that feels like a fairly small order of magnitude. That probably shouldn't be making me make radical changes to how I'm investing or saving. Whereas a 2% change for a pension scheme, which is close to 100% funded, can be quite big. Or for for a life insurance company who's selling an annuity, that 2% compared to its profit margin really is very big.
Strikes me that the insurance companies, if they're not reacting to this very quickly, are probably doing so for good commercial reasons.
Potentially.
Sarah Brennan.
Thanks, Henry. I had an observation and then a couple of questions, if that's all right. My observation comes from looking at my own pension schemes that I'm trustee of. And interestingly, over the past few years, I mean, I can't personally see that there's been a massive increase in death cases. So then when you compare these to the trend that you've seen, it does raise some thoughts about what's appropriate to adopt for your own scheme, and every scheme's individual, I know that. So that was an observation I thought I'd share. And then a question to you: have you seen increases in deaths on your own schemes, and I wondered if you had any observations or trends and data that you can share in relation to mortality broken down by sectors at all for pension schemes.
In terms of the what we've seen on our schemes, the schemes that we deal with, in general, we have seen that uptick in deaths. So to some extent consistent with the pattern that John sort of talked about, these spikes in deaths, but at the same time, as John shared those statistics on what's happened in the SAPS data, so the pension scheme data in isolation, and that was a bit more muted than what we saw in the general population. So that's maybe to some extent sort of consistent with what you've seen on your schemes. And I guess the other thought in my mind is that it just can be very difficult, depending on the size of scheme. I don't know how big your scheme is you're referring to draw conclusions from one scheme, particularly if it's a smaller scheme. But even the bigger schemes, you can sort of get sort of variations in experience. And when we're setting longevity assumptions, you need sort of quite a lot of data. It's quite a challenge to have enough data to be sort of confident that that does mean something in terms of the future trends. John, did you want to add anything to that?
I think but perhaps just on the question on mortality by sector. So yes, if you do have analysis, if you have access to material from the CMI working paper 169, which came out recently, that does have some analysis on mortality for local government schemes, other public sector, and the private sector. There's not so much that can be said about the pandemic period for those, though, in that because schemes tend to submit every 3 years. I think the other public sector hasn't yet submitted very much data at all there, but that may be of interest.
Ian Bright had a question. Sorry, Sarah, carry on. Ian Bright, I'll do it again. Ian Bright's question is comparables in other countries. Are we getting sicker, dying more than others, or are we in line with the European and G7 or world trends?
So there's been some analysis done, sort of particularly comparing to other European countries. Yes, I mean there's been a fair bit of variation between countries. So I think Bulgaria in particular was very badly hit, but sort of if we're sort of looking at the sort of comparable countries you might think of, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, for example, we're somewhere towards the middle of the pack. You know, we tended to be hit a bit worse towards the start of the pandemic, but not quite so much in the past sort of year or two. So yes, it doesn't seem that we've been hit particularly better or worse than other countries.
What about this post-COVID situation which we're in at the moment with, as you say, 20,000 extra deaths in the first quarter? Is that typical?
I mean, I think the particular quarter and the turn of the year did seem a bit worse here, but certainly Germany, Australia have also had, you know, quite bad experience there. So, you know, yes, I think that quarter in particular, we're perhaps towards the worst end, but we're certainly not an outlier.
Martin Tingle is asking, is there an easy to use mortality life expectancy tool that a small scheme could signpost members to? I don't know whether you have a sort of kind of death modeler or anything of that nature.
I'm trying to think. I don't think BW has any public tools. A vague recollection the Office for National Statistics had some sort of tool available a while ago, but whether that's sort of still around, I'm not sure, I'm afraid.
I know First Actuarial used to have one, Martin. I don't know whether they still do. They lent it out to MAPS, and it was on the MAPS website until quite recently, so you might want to have a look there. Andy Young, has ONS reduced its assumed level of mortality improvement when making national population projections?
Yes, to some extent, yes. So it's recently sort of consulting on a method for the next set of population projections. So yes, there's generally sort of a gap of a couple of years between its projections. So yes, there was I think probably say a relatively modest reduction in the I think the 2020 based figures. But yes, the 2022 based figures aren't yet out, and there's some there's been sort of consultation on quite what that should show.
And thank you to Ian Beeston for posting the link for the ONS modeler, which is now in chat if anyone wants to cut and paste it. Any further questions?
Alan has posted also a BBC life expectancy falling in the USA article as well, which I don't know whether people should have a click to, but that looks quite interesting. So
yeah, and there was an earlier question, I'm sorry I missed it, which was, you know, are we seeing bulk annuity pricing being impacted by this?
Sure, yeah. So I can comment on that. It's it's quite a common question. It's quite difficult to really get a clear answer, you know, a clear picture from insurers on how longevity is affecting their pricing, because the information you get a price, but you don't sort of see the you know, what's affecting the price or the movements in price. And there's obviously lots of different factors like competition in the market and whatever else is going on with that particular insurer, whether they're trying to get business, which can impact their price. I mean, in general, you know, insurers have all the same information available. You would expect these trends to sort of feed through in some way into their pricing. There is sometimes a little bit of a lag, a bit of caution from insurers in adopting this sort of information because of the way that insurers are set up, and they have to keep reserves. It's, you know, there's sort of reasons why they might be more cautious when life expectancy is falling to build that into their pricing. But on the other hand, there's most insurers pass on their longevity risk to a reinsurer, and there's sort of an active competitive reinsurance market, and that market you'd expect would react to these sort of trends, and that would enable insurers to be able to pass on longevity risk to reinsurers in a cheaper way when this information comes through, which should then enable them to reduce their pricing. So it's always, you know, pretty impossible to say when you get a price what, you know, what's built into there. But in general, I think we would expect these trends to reduce buyout pricing. Having said that, I guess because each scheme's technical provisions might be reducing as well because of longevity, the gap between the two might be sort of, you know, broadly similar. So whilst it's getting cheaper to buy out the gap between what you might be reserving for and the extra you have to sort of seek from an insurer, from the company. Let's say if you're hedging those liabilities, might be sort of similar. So that's a long way of saying I don't know, but I guess hopefully some of those comments are helpful.
Well, I guess we're kind of relying on the consultants to make sure that we're getting fair value. So keep us informed on that. If the insurance companies are running some vicious cartel where they aren't passing on the value of this horrible extra mortality to us in better annuity pricing, we want to know from you.
Absolutely.
I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Will, are you allowed to share the slides with some of our people? Are you happy for that to happen, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to share the slides. Yeah,
that'll be great. That'll be super. So, but that was a really good session. I hope everybody enjoyed it, and thanks again, Will. Thanks again, John, for your fantastic input. Some great questions as well as usual on pension playpen, which is fantastic. Will and John, if you could stay on afterwards, I've got a little idea for you. Next week, funnily enough, Michael Bromwich will be pleased that we are back on the annuities are pants 3. So we've had annuities are pants, annuities are pants 2, and annuities are pants 3 now next Tuesday. So Retirement Line will be giving us an update on annuities, which funnily enough might sort of cross over a little bit on what's been discussed today. So please join us next week for annuities are pants. We, as usual, want to pray for peace in the East, which I can't believe we're still saying in May 2023. And if you are a member of Playpen, thank you very much. If you're not a member of Playpen, please join. We are now doing voluntary membership. So if you want to pay £5, £3, £10, whatever you want to pay whatever you can afford. We would be delighted to hear from you on that point. The recording of this session will be available later today, so we'll get that up as well. And I wish everybody a fantastic Tuesday, happy week. And
okay.
Sadly,
can I just say,
yeah, please, Henry, do. Yeah.
A lot of people don't know where to go for these recordings. They're in the media section. Yeah. So if you go to the media section, you can find them. And Steve Hodder's LCP recording went up this morning. I know a lot of people were interested in that. His proposals that the PPF pays 100% of equivalent benefits. That's up now.
Yeah. Yeah. So please look at the media tab for all the videos. That'll be great. But Will and John, if you can stay on, that'd be great. So thank you very much. So enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and enjoy your week.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Will. Thanks, John. What this is about is just what we usually do is right at the very end have a 1-minute snippet sort of what was that all about, sort of thing. So could you perhaps within literally 30 seconds, 40 seconds, Will, give us a summary of what today was about and about the questions, the quality of the questions, and what you got out of it? Would that be that would be great.
Sure.
If you could do that?
Yeah, give it a go, and if it's not what you're looking for, we can do a take 2. So so today we had a great discussion about longevity trends, particularly looking at back at the pandemic and the knock-on impact since then, and what that means for setting assumptions for DB schemes, and lots of great questions from the audience, and some good discussion. So yeah, thanks very much for everyone who came along.
And what do you think was the biggest impact based on the research and the data you've got? What is the biggest impact on DB schemes based on today's presentation and what you've learned?
So it's really the weight of the evidence coming through in the last year, I think, that's starting to shift what schemes are doing and their assumptions. And I think probably for the first time since the pandemic, I think most schemes will now be changing their assumptions to reduce liabilities in light of what's happened since the pandemic.
So if you're a trustee or a sponsor, you should be sitting up and listening to the actuary, if evaluation's due or review's due, now's the time really to take on board this fresh data, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. If you haven't looked at your longevity assumption recently, then and definitely if you haven't looked at it since the pandemic and you took a cautious view, I think now's the time to go back and have another look, speak to your advisors, and you probably need to be making a change, I'd suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate Will. I really appreciate your time, John. And Chris, thanks for running the lobby and the session. Yeah, no, it was a great session. It was a great session.
No, it's good. It's good. Lots of questions, weren't there, from the audience?
Lots of good questions.
You usually have, but yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, no, it's really good, and I really appreciate your input. So, enjoy the rest of your day, and keep in touch and join Playpen. There are lots of exciting other things to look at, but we really appreciate your input, and it's been a fantastic presentation. So, thanks, Will.
Great.
Thanks, John. Yeah,
Thanks.
and cheers,
Thanks,
Chris.
Thank
you. Thank you
Right,
both.
cheers. Bye.
Cheers,
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.